a pleasure to come and talk about my work to such a generous audience. And generous too, because for the last 5 years, the Davis Sunrise Rotary Club has been the most consistent supporter of human rights studies at UC Davis, and also the kind of work that's gone into the Article 26 backpack, which I'm here to talk about today. So let me get started. I just have a question to start with. How many of you know where your high school diploma is? So if you needed to go somewhere very quickly, in very tough circumstances, you might have a real problem doing so, or trying to get into school somewhere else that demands that you have proof that you graduated high school, if you don't have that piece of paper. And imagine that as yourself in a position of a refugee trying to cross a border, trying to leave in the middle of the night. How high of a priority would be your academic documentation? What's interesting is, in all my research, academic documentation is often one of the most important things that refugees pack in their backpacks before they flee. So let's just start. So you've helped me on my work since about 2013, about 5 years now. 2013 was the second year of the Syrian civil war, which has been going on for now 7 years. But before that, I'd been engaged in a great deal of research in efforts to try to address similar kinds of suffering of academics and graduate students, destruction of libraries and university grounds in Iraq. So this is a strangely beautiful picture from 2003 of the burned out remains of the Iraqi National Library in Baghdad. And it was in visiting places like this, mostly to begin to see how we could address the kinds of harm that take place to universities and systems of higher education during war, that I became more and more convinced of the relationship between human rights, humanitarianism, academic freedom, and the strength of universities. Those societies which promote higher education, that protect the institutions of higher learning, are societies that in general are peaceful and prosperous. Those societies who don't, or allow them to fall victim to politics or violence, tend not to be societies that support human rights or are peaceful at all. So our story begins today, though, in this refugee camp, 2013, almost exactly a little over a year ago now, in Jordan. This is northern Jordan, the Zatari refugee camp. This was really the second year of the war, and at this point, there were something like 100,000 refugees in and around the Middle East from this war. A lot has changed in the last 5 years. The number of casualties in the Syrian war has topped about 500,000 people. The number of refugees, people who have fled the country and have registered with the United Nations, is somewhere around 5 million people. And the number of internally displaced Syrians is close to 7 million people. So that's about the population of Ohio or Pennsylvania that is either displaced or refugees. In that number, we think there were about 200,000 young people who had their higher education disrupted in some form or another, meaning they had started school and they weren't able to finish it, and the overwhelming majority of those young people were looking to try to finish it. And that's the conversation that I'm having here in northern Jordan. It's a conversation mostly with young women who were in STEM fields trying to finish up. Almost all of them brought documentation of some form or another with them, but they were having increasingly more difficult times getting into university. At the time I thought, well, why don't we just expand scholarship opportunities? You know, this is the traditional way that you address international higher education. You create a Fulbright program, or the Europeans have an Erasmus program, where you are able to bring numbers of students into universities. But by and large, to add all this up, it's not a lot. We're talking, UC Davis may take in close to 300 international students a year, but almost all of them are coming from countries that can pay large amounts of money to send them here, Saudi Arabia or Japan, or you have more and more limited seats for people, especially in places like Turkey, where you have this incredible demographic bubble of young people moving through the system, so that anytime you took a seat, you gave a seat to a refugee, you'd be taking a seat away from a citizen of that country. And I can assure you that conversation also takes place in the United States as well. So very quickly, we began to realize that the traditional methods of trying to just move people with the simple sort of exchange fellowship or international scholarship wasn't going to make much of a dent in the 200,000, a number that was increasingly was growing every year. And so we began to look around for different solutions, some of which we documented and were able to put in our in a series of reports that we published in cooperation with the Institute of International Education. Some of you have heard me talk about the time we were in Lebanon in 2013, which was a very difficult time. It was the moment when 1 millionth Syrian refugee registered. And at that point, we began to notice something really tough in Lebanon. So Lebanon is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious society that has a hard time now accepting people coming in from the outside because of a painful historical experience with Palestinian refugees. And we were beginning to notice that the Lebanese state's official education system, which is a public elementary, secondary, and to some extent higher education system, was making it more and more difficult for refugees and others to get in. So much so that this year, Human Rights Watch, working with other organizations, was able to document that fewer than 7,000 of the 1 million refugees in Lebanon are high school students now. And so this is a terrible number, because what you're doing is the possible leadership of the Syrian community in exile, or people who could be trained in engineering, medicine, law, and so on, who might be able to go back to the country and help rebuild it. They're not getting the high school education they need and preparation they need to be able to move into secondary education. So the problem is getting worse, and the solutions we've tried in the past aren't working. And this began me, to sort of reflect, for example, on this idea that higher education is part of the basic collection of human rights established by the international community at the end of the Second World War, 70 years ago this year, which says that education is a basic human right, and higher education should be open to all, regardless of ability to pay, and should be based instead on merit. So trying to sort of square that with the increasing level of discrimination and other kinds of impediments to study led me to begin to think, how do we fix this problem? And I think the most important decision that I began to make, and this sort of gives you a sense of how I think about this issue, is to break it up into smaller and smaller pieces to address one piece at a time. And my inspiration for that actually came from history. What Manny didn't mention is I'm actually a historian by training, and when I look for inspiration for some of my work, I often turn to the past to see what worked in the past, but more often what didn't work in the past. And this is something that seemed to work in the past. Does anyone know what this is? I'm showing on the screen. It's a very important humanitarian document from about 80, almost 100 years ago now. It's a Nansen passport. At the end of the First World War, large numbers of Russians and Armenians were displaced from their homelands. The Armenians facing genocide in the Ottoman Empire and the successor state of Turkey, and Russians fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. They had been denationalized, which means that they were stateless people. But in the 1920s and 30s, there was no mechanism, no international mechanism to get stateless people their documents. Right? And so what was happening is large numbers of refugees were concentrating in areas just across the border from where they'd been displaced. There were no jobs. There was increasing social problems in places like Bulgaria and Greece, and even in what became Turkey. And so Sigvard Nansen, who's famous as a polar explorer, perhaps you know the name from that, or as a fish neurobiologist, probably not as famous for that, figured out that one of the reasons why refugees were not moving to look for work was that they were afraid that if they crossed a border, they might be sent home to Russia or sent home to the Ottoman Empire where they would face death. And so we developed this passport, this document that took one item off the table in the larger universe of problems facing refugees, which was the problem, and this is a legal diplomatic term, of refoulement, meaning getting sent back to a place where something bad is going to happen to you. So that's what this did. And so my thinking was, let's try to take one set of problems off the table for refugee university students, and once that's solved, then we can move on to other elements of the problem. And so the solution we came up with was the Article 26 backpack. So we took the name, Article 26 backpack. So we took the article in the Universal Declaration that guarantees the human right of education to all, and we then began to create a system leveraging digital technology and good old-fashioned human face-to-face counseling. And I'm very pleased to say that yesterday, our platform for the Article 26 backpack went live, and you can go to article26backpack.ucdavis.edu. And so it's much more than an app. We had to keep it very simple and graphics light because this is a tool, digital tool, we're going to be using in refugee camps, or we've actually used it in refugee camps already, which have very low internet connectivity. And so it becomes very prosaic when you look at it, but there's a map section where you put in your name and your basic information. It works very well also on a handheld device. And more importantly, collaborating with colleagues in admissions and registration at the collegiate level, we developed a way for students to enter their educational data in a way that will be useful to those who might best be able to help them. And we also created a way, and I'm not going to be able to show you as well here, for people to upload and safely store their documentation. And this is that problem that I started with, which is, do you know where your diploma is? Well, I know at least where my PhD diploma is. My mom found my high school diploma and sent it down to me. So now it's in the backpack as well. And part of this also comes from a very real situation. 2 summers ago, I was in Greece. I think I've talked to some of you about this part of the project, and I met a group of young people who had their documents and their phones and their backpacks, and a human smuggler had taken them through the Balkans. They were attacked by brigands who took everything, including their phones and their paper copies of their documents. And so had the backpack been available to them, they would have lost a great deal of what they were carrying on their physical backs, but at least in the realm of the virtual backpack, all their documentation would have been preserved. And so you can see how we can enter data information that will be useful to admissions officers, scholarship agencies, and we also think possible employers. The other critical element of the backpack is its ability to be shared. So it's not just something where people can deposit things. We've created this so that people can identify those aspects of their academic background, job background, put it together into a little folder, virtual folder, and then send it to someone with a link. And only that person can open it, and that link expires after 7 days. Both ways to sort of protect the integrity of the and rights of the backpacker, but also to meet growing international standards for data privacy. And then finally, this summer, we're going to be finishing up the implementation of an Arabic language version of the backpack as well. Something which wasn't as simple as we thought it was when we started. This is Mona's, by the way. So, on the one hand, what we're trying to do as part of this emerging field where digital technology is being used to help refugees and other displaced peoples, like Microsoft's attempt to get sort of biometric data for everyone in the world, which I find slightly concerning. The Europeans are trying to do a kind of qualification passport for resettled refugees. It's led by a group in Norway. South Africa is also working on certification of prior learning and education for refugees coming from Zimbabwe and Botswana, but also as far north as Kenya and Somalia. And there's also organizations like the Institute of International Education, which runs the Fulbright program, is trying to get all resources available online for people to get access to. And then finally, the Germans have developed a way to bypass some of the questions about documentation entirely by giving people examinations in their native languages or in English, so that they don't have to, it's a kind of an ad hoc placement exam, and it's, I think, a very revolutionary approach. But ours is a little bit different, because we built the backpack from our interactions, our long-term interactions with the refugees up. And this is the now iconic picture of me for the first time talking about the backpack idea with refugee students a little over a year ago, seems like a much longer time ago than that, in Syria's Bekaa Valley, just along the border with Syria. And you can see, I'm trying to illustrate it in my own personal version of Arabic. We're trying to use art and storytelling to reach large numbers of people who may be unaware of the opportunity. And so one of our graduate students, who is a graphic illustrator and really gifted comic book artist, developed the Article 26 backpack comic, which we've printed up, both physical copies, and we'll have copies that we can distribute online. In building this, we also decided that we would use the backpack as an opportunity to help people understand the human rights idea, but also tell them that this is something that they have, and they have a certain series of rights that go along with it, and this is the Backpacker Bill of Rights. And it's basically that what they put in the backpack is theirs. And we're very clear that we don't data mine, we don't share their information, because we're dealing with populations who are what we call, in sort of international humanitarian work, vulnerable, meaning that they've been displaced from their homeland, that they're vulnerable to exploitation, that they have often knowledge deficits in terms of what's going on with, not only with the world situation, but what's just happening within their own communities. And so we have to address these issues of moving information about them very, not carefully, but very conscientiously. And this is an update. This is that same camp just a few weeks ago. And here we have, I'm showing the penultimate version of the digital platform to a group of refugee students who have been helping me for the last year on its design and evaluation. And ably assisting me, of course, are Arda and Aram. They're there on my side. So to begin to conclude, the backpack is more than an app. It's more than a digital repository. It's something that gives us a way to start to fill the gaps and pull problems off the table for refugee and at-risk and other displaced people. It gives us a chance to spend a little bit of time with them using the backpack guide process, where we have near-peer university students and other refugees who are trained on how to use the backpack go to groups of refugees and help them enroll. And we call this barefoot counseling. And a lot of it is just helping young people who've been out of education for a long time begin to reimagine themselves on that path. That they can get back in. They've been out for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years now. That higher education is still their right and something that they can seek to complete. It also provides us a way to help them build for themselves narratives of achievement. I mean, the refugee is often seen, and rightly so, as an individual who's had everything taken from them. But in the case of young people who've spent time in college or university, many of the material things may have been taken from them, but the intellectual and the achievements and the accomplishments that they have are something they can document and share with the world. But also, a narrative of achievement is important if you're a future employer or if you are a university, because you want to identify those young people who know that they're going this way. someone who can add value to your company, someone who will be successful in a university environment. We're also trying to develop for the first time best practices in higher education admissions and counseling and placement for refugees and at-risk young people. The current data suggests that fewer than 1% of all eligible refugees are in any form of higher education around the world. And I don't think that's because the refugees aren't wanting to go into higher education. It's because the administrative and bureaucratic and financial hurdles are such that prevent them from going in. So by developing best practices around how to help them and get them connected, we can begin to break down some of those barriers and try to move that needle from 1, maybe 2 or 3%, but we'd like it to reach the global average, which is close to 20%. And finally, we see the backpack as a kind of currency. What we want eventually is for admissions officers and scholarship agencies to, when someone is applying, to say, oh, where's your backpack? We would like you to use the backpack, which we also think might be one of the ways that we can develop a sustainable funding mechanism for the backpack with time. I'll just share with you some things I really appreciate about the backpack before I break for questions. One is the idea of the backpack guides. And these are 2 Lebanese young people from a very elite background in Lebanon who never would have encountered or spent time with refugees, spending time with their peers, talking about the backpack, trying to understand their situation, and building what I call pathways of solidarity between groups of young people. Ultimately, Sareen and Reem, the 2 young women here, will become leaders in Lebanese society. They will also be responsible for trying to build a society in which refugees are welcome and cared for and not facing incredible day-to-day discrimination. And here's a group of backpack guides working at the American University in Beirut. I've always loved this photograph. To me, it looks like a kind of Da Vinci's Last Supper in a way, as we're gathered around the table. But what we're seeing here is we first started using Chromebooks, which didn't work so well, to take photographs of documentation. The backpack is designed so that you can take a phone or an iPad and use the camera function, take a photograph, and upload a document straight into it. And here we see Alexandra working with a refugee student on a practice form. And then finally, one critical element of the backpack is what we call the My Story, My Story, My Future. One thing we noticed in our workings with refugee students was that they're very good at telling stories about themselves, but very poor at talking about their future. And so what we've done is we've replaced the written statement of purpose with an oral statement of purpose. And I know my time is drawing near, so we can certainly look at this later. This is a young man named Jamal, who was a university student who faced torture and expulsion from Syria, who's working as an elementary school teacher in a refugee camp now. So as I conclude, where are we going? We've finished phase 1, we've built the backpack. We're now moving to phase 2, where we call Project Inkblot, where we take the backpack out to various parts of the world, start using it, create kind of a popular buzz around it, so more and more people will sign up. And eventually, with permission of our privacy CIO at UC Davis, we will take the backpack wild. In other words, people won't have to necessarily use backpack guides to sign up. And we're looking at a 2 to 3 year window for this. And finally, we're developing what we call the compass function, which is a way to use automation to sort what we anticipate to be the tens of thousands of young people into the right counseling environment or connect them with possible employers. Thank you.